Good morning, guys. Welcome back. Glad to see you all here. Glad to see some of you guys already here even before me. That's nice. But yeah, welcome back, and we will just get started in about, 3 minutes. Hope you had a good weekend. I know that we had the Super Bowl, this weekend. Maybe it wasn't the most entertaining of all possible games just because, it wasn't really close or competitive really, but anyway, Tom Brady continues his legacy, I suppose. But yeah, good to see everybody. Hi, Sebastian, Ketan, Kevin, Jason, Jerry, Stephanie, Brandon, Mia, Naaman, Jerry, Cameron, Janice. Feel good to see you guys, and I hope you had a good weekend. Hi, Alexis. Hey there, Melanie. Hello, hello. Hi, everybody. Hey, Mark, Celine. Hey, Justin there. How are you doing, Ivan? Good to see you. Jocelyn. Yeah, so we just got another minute and a half. For now, just waiting till we get to 10 a.m. Nice to see you, Angel. Hi, Gloria. Hi, Danielle. Hi, Rudy. Hey, Sophia. All right, just a moment. Nathan and Caitlin, or Kate, I don't know. Good to see you. All right, guys, well, welcome back. It's more or less 10 a.m. now, so I'm going to let us get back into the meeting. As usual, just go ahead and toss in a little comment for your informal attendance record. That's just going to be my little record-keeping method that I'll stick with through the semester. So anyways, good to see everybody here. Hope you guys had a great weekend with the Super Bowl and everything. I had one interesting thing this weekend. On Saturday, I was a judge. I was one of the judges of the National High School Ethics Bowl competition. So I guess I was a referee in a different type of bowl game, but it was Ethics Bowl. So that's kind of like this academic competition for all these different high school teams around the country. They have a group that's coached by some faculty member, and they basically have to evaluate and discuss and analyze an ethical dilemma or issue. And I was on a panel of judges that has to score them and award points and declare who's the winner and loser. So it was kind of fun. All the issues were different and random, factory farming. Do we have an obligation to change diet because of some of the issues with factory farming? Another case, if you'd served a time in prison, do you have a moral obligation to disclose this early in a dating relationship with someone that you're getting to know? Does the U.S. have any obligation to protect user data for websites like TikTok? And on and on. So, the different teams had different cases. I would have to ask them questions to follow up on their presentation and give them points. So I was put on to that by one of my colleagues at Chapman University. It was kind of an interesting, fun academic exercise, but it did take up a lot of my Saturday. So that was my weekend anyway. But it's good to be here back with you guys. And we're just going to continue to go through our lecture series here. We have some more notes on the philosophy of religion to go over today. If you're looking at the syllabus, you'll notice that the first essay due date is the Tuesday of week 6. So this is Tuesday of week 3. My typical rule is to give you guys a 2-week period to work on the paper. So I will distribute the prompt for that first essay later on this week. I think I'll give you a little more advanced time than just the 2 weeks. But some of the material that we will lecture on in the coming meetings will be relevant to at least one of the options for the paper. So anyway, just keeping your head in the game. Obviously, we have some assignments coming down the pipeline in a few weeks, and we'll talk all about those prompts and stuff at the upcoming meetings. So not to worry, but that's coming forward in the next week or so. Okay, guys, so then let's just try and return to our topic here and get our minds back in the subject of the class after our long, 5 days away. So this is philosophy of religion that we begin the class with, and we've been analyzing and considering arguments on all different sides of the question, does God exist? So you use rubric, but is the prompt going to have multiple subjects to write on? Yeah, so there will be an option of 2 different prompts, and you'll be able to choose which one you'd prefer. They're basically going to ask you to report on 2 of the different arguments for God's existence. So we have to, finish presenting some more of these arguments. No, it's fine. One of the options is the ontological argument versus Pascal's wager. And another one of the options is to present on the cosmological argument versus the argument from design. And so there's a little more detail that will be talked about and mentioned in the prompts themselves. But yeah, it's going to be report on and then compare and contrast the 2 arguments and also refer to the objections to each one. So just if you're thinking about it, it's going to have an option. Depending on which arguments you'd rather report on, you can choose ontological / Pascal or option 2, cosmological / design. So there's that option. Yeah. Anyways, yeah, so it's all about philosophy of religion. The first argument that we studied was the ontological argument. Just briefly, I'll say a few words. It's the one that says the definition of God is the greatest conceivable being. And from this definition, the argument concludes that God must exist in the mind and in reality, because to exist only in the mind is less great than to exist in both. And therefore, in order to meet the definition greatest conceivable being, God would have to exist in both, so he does, and he can't be thought not to exist either, because if so, then he would be less perfectly great than things that cannot be thought to not exist. And then there was the trio of objections. So just quickly, there's Gaunilo. Gaunilo said that, we can invent the idea of a greatest conceivable island, but we know that it's not real. Nonetheless, according to Anselm's logic, we should have to conclude that it's real because it's greater to really exist than to be a mere idea. But obviously, the non-existence of the island is clear, and therefore any attempted argument that tries to proceed from an idea of a greatest conceivable thing to the certain conclusion that it really exists is a bad argument. If so, if that argument did work, then we would have to consider this island to be real, which is, of course, absurd. And then there was Moore's objection. G.E. Moore said that existence is not a predicate. In other words, simply stated, it's not an attribute. It's not a feature or an attribute of something. When you describe stuff, you tell us what its attributes are. But nobody ever describes a thing as existing. If I wanted to describe myself to somebody, I would say I'm a professor of philosophy, I'm in my 30s, I love to run. I would not say that I exist. This just would be out of place. So that's one way of looking at it. But his own example says the following. Consider sentences which do hold a predicate in them and how they make perfectly clear sense. And then see how they don't make sense once the predicate gets swapped out for the word exist. So if I told you that some tigers are not white, that makes sense because there are some tigers that are not white. It's a rare breed, the white tiger. But if I say there are some tigers that don't exist, taking the word white and replacing it with exist, now I have a nonsense sentence. Some tigers don't exist. What? What are you saying? That does not make sense. Or if I say most tigers growl, like he uses the predicate growl, that's also clearly understood. It just means that take the tigers, and the majority of them are growling, and the minority are not. But if I try to take the same form of sentence and use most tigers exist, this no longer makes clear sense because you cannot divide a set of things into the quantity which do exist and the quantity which don't. You can divide a set of existing things into the quantity that are growling and the quantity that are not, But things that don't exist don't have an ability to be counted or quantified in numeric terms. So looked at through these examples, he thinks it becomes clear to anyone that existence, it does not function logically as a predicate does, because it cannot replace a predicate and maintain the same kind of meaningfulness. And then there was the objection of William Rowe. So William Rowe's objection was that you cannot just prove something exists by merely defining it as existing. If so, then I could prove to you that anything exists by creating a word which means existing blank. So like existing leprechaun, leprechaun. Let's say that word leprechaun means existing leprechaun. Making up this word hasn't changed anything about the fact that there are no such things as leprechauns. His example is Magican versus Magico. And his example is Magican, existing magician. Let's say that's what Magican means. Well, if there were no magicians, or if they stopped existing, then the word would still hold the same definition, existing magician, but there wouldn't be anything like that in reality. So even if the word God means existing being, which is perfect, and we say existence is part of that definition, Rowe is arguing that let it be that that's the definition, but whether or not such a thing really exists cannot be determined based on the meaning of the word alone. Okay, and then we finished last meeting with a broad description and analysis of the cosmological argument. So we're going to move on now after I summarize briefly the cosmological argument, but maybe one of you, or any of you, I guess, could assist a little bit. Who can give me an assist on this and just tell me anything you remember about the cosmological argument? What was the basic picture here of how the argument tries to show that God exists? It's different from the ontological argument. It's not based on definition of God. So let's see, what do you think you can say? Even if it's just a couple of points or some random summarized aspect of the argument, let me know here in this chat. What would you say? Okay, necessary versus contingent. That's one thing to mention about the argument, yes, but it's kind of a little downstream because we started off the argument with a little information before that. There's the sphere in the woods example, correct, Naaman. What was the whole point of the sphere in the woods thing, though? He says, like, if you saw something like this really weird sight to see, you would know that there had to be a cause or an explanation behind why it got there. Yes, Kobe, also correct. It is based on cause and effect. So the sphere, let's focus on that for a minute. And it is by Richard Taylor. That's also correct, Brandon. The principle of sufficient reason you mentioned there. That's what the sphere thing is leading us to. The sphere thing is just to tease out the principle of sufficient reason. So the example gives us the insight, the intuition that something like that, even if it's weird, it has to have a cause. And so much more obviously, even ordinary things have to have a cause or an explanation. So the principle that he generates from the example is that when something exists, there has to be a cause or a reason for it. So that's correct, Janice. There's a reason for everything that exists. And you kind of jump to the next point, but let's take that slowly. Everything that exists has a cause. The next point is that there are either necessary or contingent truths. Okay, so let me ask this question. What is a contingent truth? Who knows that? Basic definition or concept of contingent truth. Just want to make sure that this sinks in and that we all understand it. So let's see if you can tell me about that point. Contingent truths. What are those kinds of truths? How would you state it? What a contingent truth is? Well, Janice, no. You're saying it exists on its own, but that's not a contingent truth. I think you're thinking more of like a necessary truth. Yeah. But let's begin with the contingent ones. Yeah. What is it though? I'm sure you know. So just let me know. What is a contingent truth? Okay, so here I see some comments. Good. Things that are true, but they could have been false in different circumstances. Yes, correct. So who won the Super Bowl? It was the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Is that a contingent truth? You guys follow me? It is, right? Because it happened that the Buccaneers won. But I guess had the game played out a little differently, if maybe Mahomes had been more on his game, or if their offensive line of Kansas City had been a little bit more effective or whatever, then in that case, maybe we would have seen the Kansas City Chiefs today as the Super Bowl champions, but that didn't happen. So a contingent truth, I'm just giving one example, but the concept generalizes to any infinity of different possible examples. It's just something that's true, but it might not have happened if events had played out differently, okay? Like your own birth, my birth, the fact that you're a student at Cal State Fullerton, the fact that, I don't know, we defeated the Nazis in World War II, the Allies did, that the Union won the Civil War, the JFK was assassinated. I mean, all these things happened, but you can imagine if little events had gone somewhat differently, maybe we would have different outcome. Okay, so necessary truths are another kind of truth. And the necessary truths in contrast to the contingent ones, couldn't be false. So they're things that are true, but could not even possibly, not even in theory, could they be false. So things like math, things like geometry, 1 + 1 is 2. There are 3 sides on a triangle. The interior angles of the triangle amount to 180 degrees. There's facts like these that are not subject to chance, that are not subject to circumstance. They don't vary depending on, what the weather's like or what's going on in the world. So there's necessary truths and then there's contingent truths. The contingent truths depend on something else for the fact that they happen. And the necessary truths just are true due to their own nature. Okay, now, the next point in the argument is that the whole universe exists, and we obviously know that the universe exists. But the point of the author is that the fact that the universe exists is which kind of truth? Contingent. In other words, though there is a universe, we can consider a scenario in which there had not been a universe. And I think that actually makes clear sense, because whether you're a believer in religion or you're just a science type, you think that the universe has a beginning, right? The religious practice thinks of creation, and the science person would say there's the Big Bang. But both of those things could have not happened, I guess, right? Like whatever causes a Big Bang to erupt into existence, I guess, might not have happened, and whatever creation that God decided to enact might have not been chosen by God. So anyway, the universe and everything that's in it, including me and you and all time and space, does exist. It's claimed that it is contingent, though. Since it's contingent, the principle of sufficient reason says that there has to be an explanation or a cause for it, just as much as seeing a weird sphere in the woods. Well, the universe is a thing, and it exists, and just as much as any other particular thing, it must have a cause. So what does he say from here? That if you ask the question, what could cause the whole universe to exist, there's only, like, he thinks, one answer that could possibly be given. Well, could it be that the universe causes itself? No, this doesn't work. This is a non-starter, because if something can cause another thing, then it has to be prior to that effect which it causes. So if the universe causes itself, we're speaking in contradictory absurd language, because if a thing already exists, then it can cause something. But it cannot both be the result of the cause and the thing which does the causing. That would be like a person giving birth to themselves, and this makes absolutely no sense. So the universe can't be something that causes itself, because it would have to pre-exist itself to do that. Okay, another possible question is, could the cause of the universe be something that is contingent? I want to ask you that and see someone in the chat give me some type of reply. What do you think when the question goes, could the cause of our universe be contingent? Yeah, so good, Angel. The answer is that it couldn't be something contingent which causes the universe, because if something contingent causes the universe, it cannot be the first cause. Anything that's contingent depends on something else. And so if our universe was caused by something which is not independent, but requires some other explanation for its being, then that would simply be pushing us towards an infinite regress. And in the judgment of the fans of this argument, an infinite regress is totally impossible. How could there be an infinity of events that just goes back and back and they never have a beginning? The whole sequence then is utterly incomprehensible if that's the case. So he says the only possible remaining option is that the cause of the universe is not the universe itself, nor any part of it, nor is it something that is itself contingent, but rather something necessary. A necessary truth, a necessary being is the cause of our universe, and that's God. The necessary being is something that does not depend on anything else, but everything depends on it. And that's the only picture he thinks that can coherently make sense. If the universe has a cause, it can't be something which is itself caused. Otherwise, we are not reaching to the origins. So the ultimate origin of all things must be a necessary being. Does incomprehensible always mean impossible? Well, that's a good question, Sebastian. And hold on to that thought, because we're going to discuss some of these objections to the cosmological argument today. And one of the objections is sort of like that. You hear Ernest Nagel, and he says, to the claim that an infinite regress is impossible, I don't know if that's really impossible. It may be hard to fathom, but there are ways of thinking about infinity that we could perhaps graft onto the way we look at the universe. So we'll return to that point. Some might say that though hard to comprehend or maybe somewhat incomprehensible, we could be in a universe that is itself a necessary being and therefore is independent, not requiring any external causal source. But we'll get to that. That's a good question. Okay, so we move on then into our lecture notes and series of essays. And the next topic on the same overall subject is a new argument for God's existence that we've not yet covered, and that's the argument from design. So I kind of feel, and I think the textbook lays it out this way by putting the first three arguments that you study in the book, that these are kind of like the big three for theism, for arguments trying to prove that God exists. The ontological, the cosmological, and now this design argument are kind of the major three that are often given or mentioned. So here we go. The argument from design is today's starting topic. So the argument from design, it has a couple of alternative names that sometimes a person uses instead. It sometimes has been called the argument from intelligent design. I've also heard it referred to, and this is a little more of a technical term, the teleological argument. That has to do with old Aristotelian doctrines, but teleological argument, I like in a weird way that it sort of rhymes with the other two, ontological, cosmological, teleological, but more simply stated, it's the argument from design. And this argument, one very well-known version of it comes to us from this British philosopher named William Paley. So we're going to read this discussion of the argument. William Paley was a priest in the Anglican Church, so the British Church of Christ, and he lived from, let me get his dates proper here. I think it's 1743 to 1743 to 1805. He wrote a book in 1804, close to the end of his life, I guess, which contains this argument in it. And so just some basic data about the author, his lifespan, the date that he published our topic here, and what it is, the argument from design. So William Paley, argument from design, 1804, British priest and philosopher. So let me try and now start opening up on all the info in the argument. Well, once again, this philosopher, Paley, starts the discussion with a reference to a new hypothetical scenario. So, as I've said a few times already, hypothetical scenarios are just a common part of philosophical writing and literature. In the case of the cosmological argument, we all heard about this sphere scenario, okay? Well, once again, now we have a new hypothetical that helps us to form a clear sense of the argument. And ironically, and I think just coincidentally, this also has something to do with a person we imagine walking around in the woods. So let's think about this. You're walking in the woods. Now, in the woods, you see all kinds of rocks and dirt, trees, shrubs, whatever. But suppose that you came across not a sphere this time, but just a watch, okay, like a watch, like a wristwatch, like this. It's laying there on the forest floor. Now, what's something that you know for sure about the backstory behind a watch? Okay, like what is the only way that a watch could come to exist? What has to happen, or what has to be there for watches to be in the world? What's the only possible way that a watch could originate? Let me ask that, and we'll go from there. They are made. That's good, Leo. Made by what? Made by the wind? Made by a volcano? Made by an earthquake? No, it has to be made by some kind of watchmaker. That's right. There has to be some type of intelligent being that crafts and puts together the watch. Well, you say time has to exist, Brandon. I mean, that's a very esoteric point. I mean, time is being measured. The passage of time is being measured by the watch. But we're talking rather about like what kind of things cause the watch to exist, like what kind of things produce it. And certainly a watch cannot come together randomly or through luck. You understand? Like, there could never be like a tornado that blows through town and it kicks up a bunch of dust in the air and a volcano pops off at the same time and somehow it fuses the elements in the sky just randomly, and through chance a watch just ends up like sitting there on the sand of the beach. Just no human created it, but just forces of nature. Nobody would think that that could happen through some type of unguided, unconscious process. So you understand and feel what I'm saying? Like, there has to be an intelligent being that puts the watch together. Why is that so obvious, that a watch has to have an intelligent creator? Well, maybe you have a view about that. I think you do, because many of you have said essentially the same. Someone has to put it together. It had to be made. Someone has to make it. What is it about the watch which makes that so obvious to you? You know, and it could be something very obvious that you write, but just put it out there. Like, what is it about a watch that you know it without even having to think much, that there's somebody that had to make it? Okay, good, Mark, because it's intricate. And you say the same thing, Leo. Correct. Yeah, it's very intricate. The assembly of all the little parts, all the little gears and springs, they have to be just so arranged in order for it to produce the ability to measure the passage of time. So you would have to have a mind of some intelligent being that thinks, I would like to create a timekeeping device, and I'm going to dredge up all the parts, go through the process of assembly, and then create this object. So clearly, the complex details and its function is what makes it clear that it had to have a maker. So from this initial example, this hypothetical of a person finding a watch in the woods, we draw this principle that I'm going to write here on the board. Okay, so this is all building towards this principle. If something has a purpose or function or complex assembly of parts, then it must have had an intelligent creator. I'm going to put these two as sort of backslash because they're kind of synonymous, but if something has a purpose or function and an intricate assembly of parts, intricate or complex, well, if that is the case, then in that case, it must have had an intelligent designer or creator. Okay, so that is just a point that he wants us to kind of agree with based on the intuitions advanced in the example of the watch. And let me read a little bit then from the words of the author. Here's how he says this. Okay, so keep in mind, he's speaking in 1804, so a little bit of old-fashioned manner of speech, but I hope it's clear enough. He says this: in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and I was asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for all I know, to the contrary, it has been there forever, nor would it perhaps be easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I found, so he says, first of all, if I found a random rock, there's no real reason to think that it has an origin with intelligence because it doesn't do anything and it doesn't have any kind of parts that allow it to do any function. But then he says this: but suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I would never think of the answer that I gave before, that for all I know, the watch might have always been there. Yet why would I not give this answer for the watch like I did for the stone? Why isn't it as admissible in this case as in the other? For this reason and none other, namely, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we cannot see in the stone, that its several parts are framed and adjusted and put together for a purpose. They are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, of a different size from what they are, or placed after any other manner, or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it. And then he goes into some of the little details of how watches are actually assembled and what the parts are under the hood, as it were, of the watch that allow it to tell time and function. Okay, so I hope the point has kind of come clear. All he's really trying to do is explain this thought that if something like a watch exists, which clearly has all these complex parts put together in a particular order so that it can produce the function, the purpose of telling time. If there's something like that, a purposive functional object with all these complex parts in it, then an intelligence had to put it together. Nobody would think that a watch could have ever come about through randomness, through chance, through forces of nature, or just events of those kind. So it takes a mind, doesn't it, for a watch to come into the reality. Now, why does he give the example of a watch? It's because it's 1804, and I guess back then, it's probably one of the more impressive, fast examples you could point to something of human innovation and industry that does perform a purpose. But if this essay had been written today, any number of different examples could have easily been given. I mean, you could say you see a cell phone sitting on the forest floor, and you know that something like a cell phone, which has the ability to make phone calls or web browse or just use apps or has a camera in it, that something like that could not have come about unless there was an intelligent designer that initially manufactured and designed the concept of the phone, or an automobile or a computer. So given the technological set of items that were in existence back then, he goes with the case of the watch. But I'm telling you that it could generalize to any item of technology, modern or pre-modern, that performs a purpose due to all the carefully arranged parts. Okay, so let me add to the next part of this discussion here. So this part's a little tricky. I just want to make sure that we don't get lost on it. He says that there are some things about the watch that even if you saw it in the watch, it would not lead to any doubt that it did have a maker. So it's a little bit of confusing wording, but what he says is, here are some factors that would not lead to any doubt, that would not cause you to doubt that the watch has a maker, okay? Okay, so this is on pages 32 and 33, and he actually has a set of 8 of these factors listed by Roman numeral. I'm not going to talk about all 8 of them because I thought some were more important than others and some were a little repetitive, but here are the points of that discussion that I thought were key to understand. Okay, so one thing is this. Suppose that when you encounter this watch on the ground, wherever it is, you realize that you have never seen a watch being made ever in your life. Okay, so suppose you have not seen a watch being made. You've never seen a watch being made. Okay, so what's going on here is, like, if you see, many of us just have watches, or we see watches, but we don't necessarily have the experience in the past of literally watching one. I don't want to reuse the word watching the watch. Most of us don't have the experience of having seen a watch being put together in like a watchmaker's factory or workshop, okay? Me, for example, I've never seen that. I mean, I own several different watches, but I've never ever looked at the assembly line process or a watchmaker putting the parts together. Have you? I mean, probably most of us haven't. You'd have to really take a special interest in it, like go out and find one of those videos, how it's made or something on the internet, kill some time looking at, a watch being put together and piece by piece. But most of us probably haven't seen watches being made. So suppose you never saw a watch actually literally being crafted, okay? How it's made is fun, yes, but suppose that you never saw this episode, okay, of watches. Well, would that make you think, I don't know if the watch has a creator that has intelligence, because I've never seen one being made by anybody, so how can I really say I know that? Look, obviously, you don't need to literally see it being made to know that it is made, right? It's obvious enough that it has an intelligent creator just from the other facts that we already discussed. The fact that it tells time and that it produces that function. And also the fact that it has all these very carefully assembled parts arranged just so. That's enough to know that it has an intelligent creator, even if you've never seen the person doing it with your own 2 eyes. So here's his point. Say you've never seen a watch being made. So what? That still doesn't lead to significant doubt that it has a maker. That would not cause anybody to say, until I see one being made, I would doubt that it has a maker. You understand? It's like, here's another example. See the cell phone that I'm using, right? I mean, many of you guys are using cell phones too. It's funny because it's watching our live stream, so it's like there's me a couple seconds on delay. Anyway, though, I've never seen a cell phone being put together, you know, but I know that the cell phone in my hand has to have had an intelligent creator, because something like that can't just fall out of the sky or just bubble up out of like the volcanic ash. It's something that has to be put together by a human person or some person with intelligence, some being with intelligence, because it takes intention and craftsmanship for such a thing as this to come into reality. Okay, so there's one point. Even if we have not seen a watch made, that does not cause any doubt that it has a maker. Okay, and here, another point. Suppose that this watch that you come across is flawed or broken somehow. So the watch has a flaw. So like, say that this watch that you see on the ground is not in proper working order. It's broken, basically. Like, suppose that maybe the pointer hands of the clock face don't move, or maybe they keep just ticking back and forth without showing the proper time. A broken watch like that, that's not properly functioning. It's still pretty obvious, though, isn't it, that it's the product of some intelligent manufacturing process, a designer who created it. Even a broken object that normally would perform some given function can still be clearly, obviously seen as something that was designed for that function, even though in this one case, it's not able to correctly perform it, right? So like if you find a cell phone with a cracked screen and it doesn't turn on, and you can't like swipe across to like open the apps and stuff. So it's really messed up and broken. You know, I've seen some cell phones that are like that. Would you look at the broken cell phone and say, well, normally when they work, I think they have a maker, but this one is so messed up and busted that maybe it didn't have a creator? Nobody would think that. Nobody would think that just because this one's in broken, not working order, that it therefore lacks some kind of intelligent manufacturer, because the evident marks of its construction, assembly, and design are still there, even if in this occasional random case, it's a copy of that kind of design that's not working right. Okay, so look, two things that don't cause doubts about the watch having a maker. Suppose you haven't seen a watch being made, you still know it has a maker. Suppose that the given watch has some kind of flaw or defect, it still obviously has a maker. Like if you see a car that's not in working order because the engine doesn't start, you know that it still had to have an intelligent manufacturer, despite the fact that that's not one that's really doing its job well. Okay, now here's another point. Suppose that you don't know how it works. You do not really understand how it performs its task or function. So you don't know how it works. All right. Here again, this would never cause you to significantly doubt that it had a maker. Like considering my own watch that's on my wrist right now. It's got a digital clock face. So for me to know exactly how it works, I would have to know a little bit of information about electrical engineering. I would have to know about like how it displays the proper time on the clock face. I use the watch, I'm happy to have it, but I don't really know all those little facts. It's similar to like a car, right? Many people have automotive expertise, and they could tell you like how it is that the engine works and how the cylinders fire and all of that. Me, I'm really not very knowledgeable about those things. I drive the car and I like driving it, but I don't know how it works under the hood really. Okay, but still, even if I don't know how it functions or works, I could still tell that it had to have an intelligent designer, because something that complex with that much internal assembly of parts that performs this type of function, it must have had a creator, even if I don't know how the created object works. This computer that I'm giving you this lecture on, or that you're watching this lecture on, unless you're really heavy into like computers and computer science, you might not really know exactly how it functions. You couldn't give an account to somebody. It's just sort of like I turn it on and I use it. Even if you don't know what's going on under the hood of the car, under the hood of the watch, under the hood of the computer, to coin a phrase, you still know they have got a creator. So nobody would doubt that the watch has a maker just because they don't currently understand its function or how it functions. And then finally, one more thing. Nobody would say that instead of it having a creator, it's just the product of chance processes of nature. So nobody would say that the watch was caused by random chance events. As I was trying to sort of mention before, nobody would consider this a serious, better hypothesis, that instead of the watch having an intelligent designer, maybe it actually just comes from nature. Maybe it just, things happen and fall into place, and the watch is the outcome of all those chance events that have no consciousness behind them. Nobody would take that to be the possible explanation for how the watch comes to exist. Okay, so we can now move from this little part of his discussion, and let me just kind of take stock of where we are at. He begins by saying, imagine you see a watch in the woods. Okay, point taken. If you see a watch, you know it has an intelligent creator. Why? Because it has a purpose, a function, telling time, and all the little parts inside have to be just so carefully put together so that it can do that. That gives us clear knowledge that it has a creator. Now, if you don't know how it works, you still know it has a creator. If it's broken when you found it, you still know it has an intelligent creator. If you've never seen yourself a watch being made, still though you know it has an intelligent creator. And nobody would say that instead of it having this intelligence that created it, that it's somehow just the result of chance events. Nobody would say that this is a better idea. So this leads us to almost the conclusion of his argument. Maybe some of you guys that have either read it or are just carefully listening, you can kind of anticipate the next steps of where he's going to go with this, right? Because the point he's laid out is that if something has a purpose or function, it had to have an intelligent creator. So now he's going to switch the example from the watch and a man-made object that has purpose and function and careful internal arrangement of parts. Now he's going to switch the example to something found in nature that has purpose and function. Okay? So he gives the example of the eye. The eye. The eye, as he would argue, is also something that has a purpose and a function. And you could say that it's even more impressive than anything that a human could create, like a watch or a telescope or anything else. What's the purpose of the eye, the function of the eye? It's clear. It's to see. It's what you're using right now to view and see my lecture and see me giving you these notes. So the eye is also something found. It's an object that exists in this universe, and it has a purpose and it has a function, maybe much more impressive even than the function seen in the example of the watch, to have vision. Also, if you consider what's going on internal to the eye, and you consider the anatomy and the physiology of the eye, there are so many little parts, biological components of it, that have to be just so arranged in order for vision to happen. There's rods and cones, etc., within the retina of the eye that take in the light, and the visual information is processed in the brain, giving you the ability to see things in your environment. So what he's saying is that if we believe that whenever there's a watch, there has to be an intelligent watchmaker, now we have an analogy going, that the watchmaker is to the watch as what is to what. Let me ask you guys if you think you can construct or complete his analogy that he's building towards. Wherever there's purpose, function, and intricate assembly of parts, there had to be an intelligent creator to generate that thing. That's what we said about a watch. So he's saying that the watchmaker stands to the watch in the same relation as what stands to what. Yes, God to the world, or to be even more maybe precise, the relation that God stands in to the things in the world that have a purpose, a function, and this intricacy of parts. So things like the eye, or not just the eye, the nose, the ears, the tongue, the wings of the bird, the echolocation of the dolphin or bat, the digestive system, the circulatory system, the process of photosynthesis that gives plants the ability to convert sunlight into energy. Like all of these different things are either objects or processes that have a function and a purpose, and they can only do that if all the parts are just laid out and assembled in a precise way. So he says, nobody would have ever thought that the watch could have come about in any other way. Nobody would have ever said of a watch that this is something that could occur through just random, unconscious, natural processes. So if a watchmaker has to be the thing that ultimately issues the watch, then he thinks an intelligent force, an intelligent being, also has to be the sort of craftsman of the things that we see that are made in nature that have a purpose and function. So God is like standing in as the master watchmaker of all things in nature that show a purpose, function, and complexity. So let me read then his words on it. You can maybe hear it from the horse's mouth, as they say. So he says, every indication of design which exists in the watch exists in the works of nature. The difference is that on the side of nature, they're greater and more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. I mean that the design of nature surpasses the design of art in the complexity, subtlety, and curiosity of the mechanism, and still more, if possible, do they go beyond it in number and variety. Yet in many cases, they're not less evidently mechanical, not less evidently designed, not less evidently accommodated to their end or suited to their office than the most perfect productions of human ingenuity. He says, I know no better method of introducing so large a subject than that of comparing a single thing with a single thing, an eye, for example, with a telescope. As far as the examination of the instrument goes, there is precisely the same proof that the eye was made for vision as there is that the telescope was made for assisting it. Had he written this today, I think he might have used the camera as the comparison to the eye, because in those two cases, they both process light and form a copy of the image seen. But in his time, they had telescopes, so he's using that as the comparison. He says they are made upon the same principles, both adjusted to the laws by which transmission and reflections of rays of light are regulated. So that's his overall argument. Let me see a comment here from Kobe. Couldn't an argument on this be evolution? And that is a very good point. Yes, we're going to certainly actually talk about that as one of the possible objections. So hang on to the thought, but I continue your comment. Since it happens naturally over time, or would he say that evolution was intentional decision by God? Yeah, so Darwin's theory of evolution and the origin of species came forward a couple of decades after Paley's life ended in 1805. So he wouldn't have been able to benefit from the knowledge of evolution theory as we have. And that is certainly one of the major objections that is given in the current day against the intelligent design argument. Fans and followers of the argument, though, insist that the probabilities involved of life developing in this kind of highly specialized vertebrate intelligent life form that we have here is vanishingly small, given, just the circumstances of the universe and nature. But I always have thought in my own mind that those probability-based arguments are kind of weak, because even if something has a low probability of happening, if you have infinite time and space, it's bound to happen at some point. So it's kind of like someone shoots an arrow just at a random side of a barn, and then they go up to where the arrow lands and draws a bullseye around it. And they say, how could this arrow possibly have landed on that one spot, right on the bullseye? Well, wherever it landed, you're drawing a bullseye around it, and now saying that there's a million positions on the side of the barn, how could it be in that one position? Well, it had to land somewhere. And now we assign probabilities in a way that don't actually relate to how likely or unlikely it was. The monkey typewriter thing, yeah, Mark. That if we had a infinite number or like astronomically large number of monkeys randomly hitting keys, that eventually one of them would type out a Shakespeare play. But that is sometimes given as an argument against this, because the probabilities involved in such cases are so low that it might make more sense for someone to think, no, this is guided by an architect of nature. It was done intentionally, and that means that it didn't have to be this extremely low likelihood probable event, but rather something that was guaranteed and assured by the guiding hand of God that works with nature. Anyway, though, that's, say hi to Peachy. She's been a good girl today. She's kind of hanging out off stage of the camera. But yeah, that's the argument overall. So this is an argument based on where could things with purpose and function have originated from. And it's trying to lean very heavily on the intuition that we get from looking at a watch. We know of a watch that it has to have a creator because of its complexity, function, and the innate assembly of parts. And he says, well, if that principle is true, then it should extend across to things found in nature that show a similar level of complexity and function. So there is the intelligent design argument, as some call it, that things in nature, like say me, you, other living systems, aspects of our biotic system on the planet Earth, couldn't have occurred through random chance processes any more likely than a watch could have occurred through such processes. Okay, now we're going to learn a whole bunch of random different criticisms of these authors' views. So let's just try and get into them. Yes, Peachy's a good girl, very cute. She's so sweet. I mean, I could talk about her all day, but that'd be a whole separate meeting. Okay, so now we want to learn about the words and writing of this guy, Ernest Nagel. So Ernest Nagel, he's an atheist. He's an American philosopher of the 20th century. He lived from 1901 until 1985. And he was originally born in Czech Republic, but then he immigrated to the United States as a young child, so he's a naturalized U.S. citizen for most all his life. And since he's an atheist, obviously this means he doesn't believe in God, and he hasn't been convinced by the different arguments trying to prove and establish that God exists. So he's on a mission in this paper from 1959 called Does God Exist? To just sort of disprove or criticize, rebut the various arguments for God's existence that we've all studied so far. So this is Ernest Nagel, knows that time and wrote this paper in 1959. He was a professor at Columbia University throughout his life, and he actually also got his PhD there, so he's a big figure in the history of Columbia's department, you know, from being a student many years and then a professor throughout his life. Okay, so Does God Exist by Ernest Nagel, 1959. We're going to learn now what he had to say. So the paper here is basically, he takes us on a little tour of all the major arguments for God's existence, and he just tries to point out and call out all the flaws and objections that he has with each different one. So he starts with his criticism of the cosmological argument that we were studying just recently. Let me list this as his criticisms, problems with the cosmological argument, according to Nagel. Okay, so before launching into what all the problems are in his judgment, he first just summarizes the argument itself. And let me just quickly read this. One of the oldest intellectual defenses of theism is the cosmological argument, sometimes called argument from first cause. Briefly put, this is how the argument goes. Every event must have a cause. So if we have an event A, just a little visual for you, A must have as cause some event B. So suppose this is like the arrow of causation, pointing toward the effect from the cause. So if A exists, it had to have a cause from somewhere else, which in turn has to have some cause C. Okay? But if this just goes on to infinity, right? Little infinity symbol. If there is no end to this backwards progress of causes, then the sequence would be infinite. And in the opinion of those that make the argument, an infinite series of events is incomprehensible and absurd. Therefore, there must be a first cause, and the first cause would be God, who initiates everything else. So that's his summary of the argument anyway, but now we want to learn what his criticisms of it are. So here's how he criticizes it. Some of these criticisms might have been, you might have thought of them yourself just in studying the argument. One of them is this point. First of all, does everything really have to have a cause? Let me put it as a sort of rhetorical question. So one thing you could pose as a problem to the argument is trying to resist its fundamental claim that all things must have a cause. You could say, well, I'm not so convinced on that point. Maybe many things or most things have to have a cause, but maybe not the entire system of the whole universe. Like me and you are things within the universe, particular individuals. And you could argue, yeah, maybe me and you and other individual objects have to have a cause, but not the entire superstructure of all of space and time. Maybe there are some things that don't necessarily have to have a cause, and if that's the case, maybe we have started off on the wrong foot by making the first premise of the argument that everything must have a cause. But beyond that, other problems can still be mentioned. Suppose that we think everything has to have a cause. If so, then why wouldn't who or what have to have a cause? Do you think you can formulate the question that I'm about to write up here? If everything has to have a cause, then why doesn't this thing have to have a cause? Namely what? Try and tell me what you think is that comment that I'm looking for here. If everything really has to have a cause, well then what? Yeah, why wouldn't God have to have a cause? Exactly. So if everything must have a cause, okay, so I mean, one thing that some argue about here in the case of the cosmological is that it says everything's got to have a cause, so the universe has to have one. And since the universe has to have a cause, it's got to be God. But these 2 points could seem to be inconsistent with each other. Everything has to have a cause, but wait, no, not God though. He does not have to have a cause. Which one is it? Does everything have to have a cause? If so, you would think everything includes God too. But if God does not have to have a cause, then why have we argued that everything has to have one? It seems like the argument wants to have it both ways. Everything has to have a cause, except when we ask about the cause of the universe, let's just stop inquiring into causes at all. So that's another possible criticism. Brandon, you say God wouldn't be as all-powerful and great if something caused him. It would make him less great according to the ontological argument. Well, yes, that's true. Nobody is saying that God has a cause, at least conceptually speaking. The point that's being made here is that in the argument it says that everything has to have a cause, but it denies that God has one. Why would it affirm that everything has a cause if it's also going to deny that God has one? So that's another possible problem with the argument, at least some critics would say. Rudy, shouldn't God have one as well? Or perhaps even whoever made God, it's infinite. Yeah. Well, the argument itself says that it's not possible to have an infinite sequence of contingent creators that never starts with any individual creator that's independent of prior causes. But as we're looking through the criticisms for now, I just want to kind of make it apparent what his points are. One question you can ask is whether we should agree that everything has to have a cause. A further question related to that is that even if you think so, why then would you deny that God has to have a cause? Here's another point of criticism that follows, or another problem. If God could have no cause, right? So suppose that we agree with this, God has no cause. If God could have no cause, then why couldn't simply this be uncaused and necessary? What do you think is my suggestion here? Well, what I'm referring to is the physical universe, the whole universe. So if God could have no cause, then why couldn't the universe have no cause? Okay, so the argument says everything and the universe even itself has to have a cause. But God, though, no, he does not have to have one. Well, if we accept that there could be something that is uncaused, namely God, then why wouldn't we be able to just sort of transpose that thinking over to the universe itself and say the universe is simply the uncaused necessary being that doesn't have any kind of prior factor behind it that causes it? Because look, if we're looking for something to be the necessary being that everything is based on, at least with the universe, we know it exists. I mean, here it is, right? The existence of God is a little more mysterious because it's claimed to be something that's separate from the universe, independent from it, and from which the universe derives. That means that we would have to postulate the existence of something that's completely separate from the universe, which bears some kind of hard to understand relation to the universe itself, so that it could create it. On the supposition that the universe itself is the necessary being, there's no requirement to kind of consider or conceive of the relationship between the two realms, the creator and that which is created. So you could argue that it's a little more on sure footing, and it's less controversial to consider the universe as this necessary being with no cause. because like something has to be a necessary being with no cause to found this causal series. The cosmological argument says that it's God which is the first link in the chain. But if the universe is self-standing, requiring no external cause at all, then that would eliminate the necessity of invoking the existence of God to explain how we got here or how everything exists. Okay, now one more point of problematic criticism, he thinks, for the cosmological argument. I'm going to put it up here since I've run out of space below. But the last problem he mentions is this one. Is an infinite regress really impossible? Maybe not. So I'm asking it as a rhetorical question, but implied by the question is perhaps no, perhaps it's not impossible. Remind yourself that the cosmological argument says that we couldn't have an infinite regress of causes that just go back and back and back and never have an origin, because that would be absurd, that would be impossible. Here, Nagel says, is it though? Is it really impossible for there to be an actual infinity of causes? And here's why he says it might not be impossible. Because in like mathematics and geometry, set theory, logic, trigonometry, in these different fields, we actually do have a working understanding of the concept of actual infinity. So maybe we could utilize the same way of thinking about the timeline of events in universe history. So like, for example, right, take these two numbers, 0 and 1, two numbers on the number line. Is there a number that's halfway between those? Like an intermediate value numerically? Yes. And you guys know that it's 0.5, right? 0.5 is in between 0 and 1. Okay, so ask a new question. What about between 0 and 0.5? Is there a midpoint value between those? And yes, again, you should know that it's 0.25. So do you understand I could keep asking this question for a new value and I could go on infinitely long and I would never run out of answers. What's the value between 0 and 0.25? Well, it's 0.125. And then the math gets a little trickier, but we could keep doing this forever because you could simply expand the decimal position out and subdivide it by 2 again. What that means is that on the number line, there are an infinity of real numbers between even the two closest points on the number line. So there are just as many numeric values between 0 and 1 as there are in the entire natural number series between all the positive integers. So that's one way of thinking about actual infinity. When you have a subset of a system that has just as many members as the whole system does, that means that it's got infinite density within these number lines or even geometric lines. Here's another example from geometry. Take this line segment, AB. Okay, so that's the line segment AB, notation from geometry right there. Here's the midpoint, M, the point that bisects the line and cuts it in half. So now we have a new line segment, A to M, and there's a midpoint between those, and it's M prime. And we could continue to do this, and we can never exhaust the range of points between even the two closest distances on the geometric line, because it's got infinite linear density, meaning that there are just as many points even between A and M as there are between A and B, and so forth. So one way of looking at the concept of the universe having an infinity of causes that lead us to this moment could be thinking of the timeline of causation as having infinite density, infinite linear density, in the same way that these lines on the page or in the mathematical concept do. So maybe it's not impossible that the number of events that has led us to this is actually infinite and inexhaustible, in the same way that we can't exhaust the values on these mathematical and geometric examples. But anyway, I digress. That's just one more thing he says to try and give expression to the idea that an infinite regress may not really be as impossible as it was argued to be. So let me just repeat his own words here, and you can then connect it to the discussion on the board. He says the cosmological argument is ancient, and it has impressed many generations of minds, but nonetheless it's a weak argument, he says. First, let me set aside this question concerning whether every event has a cause. So right away he's questioning that. He says, okay, but set it aside. Even if we assume that, it is surely inconsistent to assume a first cause as a way of escaping from the infinite regress, because if everything has to have a cause, why doesn't God have to have one? So he mentions this question. And then he says, the standard answer is that he doesn't need one because he causes himself. But if God is a self-caused necessary being, then why couldn't the universe just be self-caused? Why would we assume the existence of God that transcends the universe to bring it into being? And then last, he says, the supposed inconceivability and absurdity of an infinite regress of causes would not be admitted by anyone familiar with the modern mathematical analysis of infinity. And so therefore, he says, the argument does not stand up to scrutiny. So there you see Ernest Nagel's objections and criticisms of the cosmological argument. But he doesn't stop there. Okay, so he also has criticisms to mention of the other big arguments that we've all kind of studied, the ontological and the design argument. So the next one that he goes through is the ontological argument. We spend a lot of time on that, and so I just want to say this briefly, because his own criticism is not really much different than the one of G.E. Moore. G.E. Moore's objection was that existence is not a predicate, it's not an attribute. And he just kind of borrows that same idea, but he gives a slightly different example to make the point. So let me just try and talk to you about his example as to why existence is not an attribute. Okay, he gives this example of a $100 bill. And so you guys all know that, like, in the US monetary system, the big Benjamin Franklin blue-faced $100 bill banknote, right? So you know the definition and the concept of that unit of currency. Now, I don't know if you have one with you right now, like in your wallet, or you don't. But here's the point to understand. Whether you actually have a $100 bill with you or not has no effect at all on whether or not that's the correct definition. So if you have the $100 bill with you, if you don't, either way, the definition of that unit of currency remains the same. Okay, so his point is that whether something presently exists or not is a separate issue from how you define it. You could have the $100 bill, you could not have it, but that would not affect its definition at all. Okay, now his example of the $100 bill is, in my view, it's a little awkward. So let me give you a slightly different one that makes the same point. Okay, take dinosaurs, right? They don't exist anymore. They used to exist. Now there's just the fossilized remains. But the definition of dinosaur hasn't changed at all. What it is for something to be a dinosaur is the same definition whether they exist or not. So suppose that tomorrow, you know, we build Jurassic Park or something, and we find DNA samples that we can use to, like, regenerate them in a lab. When the dinosaurs come back, having been extinct before, that doesn't change the definition either of what dinosaurs are. So again, the point is this: existence is not something that you would provide in the definition statement of what something is. Whether it exists, stops existing, starts existing again, the definition stays the same throughout all those changes. So that's another way of putting the point, that you would not mention existence in a description of what something's features are or what it is like. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? Okay, so that's his little rundown of the ontological argument. Now, his next point of criticism is of the design argument that we just now all studied, the one about, you know, the analogy of the watchmaker to God and the watch to things in nature that have a purpose, like the eye or anything else. He has a couple of major points of critique here, so I'll just put it up as problems with the argument from design. Okay, so one thing that he says is that considering the analogy of the watch to the eye, the whole design argument is based around that analogy, that if you think a watch has a creator, you've got to say the same thing about the eye, because in a similar sense, they both have complexity and they both perform a function. But he's going to attack that analogy. He says this analogy is actually weak. The watch and the eye are not alike in the relevant ways that would make this a good analogy. So what he says is that although the watch and the eye do both have a function, it isn't really the presence of the function within the watch that lets us know with total certainty that it has a creator. There's a much more boring and basic reason that we know the watch has a creator, and it has nothing to do with its function. It's just because we humans are those that make watches. So of course we know that they have a creator, because we literally are the creators. So he says the real reason we know the watch has a creator is because we make watches, not because it has a design or because it has a function. Okay, so because we make the watches literally ourselves, we definitely know that they have a maker. Human makers make watches, and we are humans, so we know that. It's not because it has a function. We would know that it has a maker, whether it had a function or not, as long as it was a product of human industry. So think of other examples, like if I make a big cube and I install it in an art museum, I'm like a modern artist, right? You would know that the cube has a maker because we know that only human beings make artwork. Even though the cube is not something that has any kind of function. It's not there to do anything. It's not there to perform like any task or purpose. It doesn't conduce to vision or to timekeeping or anything else. So we know that the things that are clear products of human technology and human innovation are made by humans. That has nothing to do with whether they have a function or not. So he says, although the watch and the eye both have a function, it isn't the function of the watch which gives us that obvious knowledge that it has a maker. Okay, and now one more point. When we switch over to the example of the eye and other natural things that have a function, there's a better, and he thinks more well-supported hypothesis to explain how those things have acquired their function and purpose that does not require any assumption of the existence of God. And so, Kobe, I think you were anticipating this already, and that's why I said hold your thought, because that's what he's talking about now, evolution and the theory of Darwinian biology. So the function of the eye, I'm going to write here. Let me just write it. I don't want to throw her down right away, so I'm going to put this here, and then I'll clear her out so you can see the comment. Well, what I'm writing is that the function of the eye can be explained without assuming a designer, and that is through the theory of evolution. Okay. Good, Peachy. Peachy learning to read. Okay, yeah, so it says the function of the eye, etc. I say etc. because it's not merely limited to the eye. Any other example of something in nature with a purpose could be given as well. The wings of a bird, the nose, the ears. But anyway, the function of something in nature like the eye can be explained without assuming any type of intelligent designer. And that alternative explanation is through the theory of evolution and Darwinian biology. So yeah, and it's true, Jerry, she's a very curious kitty. So look, here is a pair of points that he thinks effectively rebuts the design argument. Number one, when we look at the function of the two things, we notice that the function of the watch can be eliminated as the real basis to know that it has a creator. So though they have that commonality, it's not the real indicator of the maker of the watch. It's rather that we make watches. And then when we consider the function of the eye, it can be explained without the same type of hypothesis as we have in the case of the watch. The function of the eye can be explained and is explained scientifically through the process of natural selection. And according to that theory, there's no consciousness or intelligence that guides the hand of evolution. There's just a set of beings. Some of them have random mutations that make them more capable of surviving in their environment. And because of that, they more effectively pass on their genes to the next generation because they mate and reproduce more successfully. So over a long span of time, the traits that are more fitness enhancing and survival enhancing get naturally selected for, and those that don't die off. And so that's how, through long geologic timescale, we evolve things like eyes, ears, wings, or whatever the life form needs to survive within its environment. So, here he thinks we can break down the design argument, which is crucially based around the analogy of the watch to the eye. And he says the comparison is really not apt, because where they have similarities, like they both have a function, that similarity is irrelevant to the knowledge that the watch has a maker. And in the case of the function seen within nature, it can also be explained by a different type of hypothesis than the one offered in case of the watch. So he sees sufficient reason to doubt, or at least be critical of, the design argument. Now, from there's just a little bit more that's left in Nagel's piece. He presents a couple of additional miscellaneous arguments for God's existence that he wants to quickly set aside and view. But it takes a few moments of discussion to kind of provide the commentary on those arguments and then show his criticism. So I'll have to save that for the upcoming meeting on Thursday. But that's no problem. So on Thursday, let's see, we'll finish up the last piece of this Nagel article. We'll cover the Blaise Pascal article that I have on the list, and we'll try to get into the work of W.K. Clifford. So that's what your goal is. You should try to read as far as through the syllabus, up through and including W.K. Clifford's article, Ethics of Belief. And we should be able to catch up with all of that and be fully in sync with the schedule on the syllabus by next week. And as I said, I'm working on the prompts for you guys, and they'll be ready to go within a week. So we'll be in touch on that. Anyways, I guess we're good then. Does anybody have any questions before we close? Or if not, then just let me know that we're all good. And if so, then I'll just I'll class for now. Are we all right? Everyone's good? No questions out there hanging around? Read up to W.K. Clifford. So finish the Nagel article. Then there's a Blaise Pascal article, very short. And then there's W.K. Clifford. So try to finish. His last name is Clifford. Yes, W.K. is his first name. W.K. William Kingdon, but he goes by the initials. William Kingdon Clifford, British philosopher. Yeah, he's going to talk about the ethics of belief, when it's a good idea, or when it's even right or wrong to believe something. So he has interesting argument on that. It's in the syllabus. You'll see it there. Just go back to the syllabus and follow the dates. We're pretty much on track, so it's all there. Well, thanks, Jesus, for being here, and I'm glad that it went by quickly. It's nice when it doesn't seem like the lecture goes on and it's boring. I think that the topic is interesting, so that handles a lot of it, at least I think so. But anyways, take care, guys, then. I guess we're all good. I'll see you back on Thursday in a couple days. If you need anything, you can always email me. But until then, see you soon, all right? Have a good day, and take care.